Hello, I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona. This bottle represents one man's clever ideas that turn the contents of this bottle into a multi-million-dollar business. By creating a store at your door, the concept that developed into the biggest direct sales operation in the world, J.R. Watkins built the foundation for a business empire and turned his family into the richest family in the history of Winona County. J.R. Watkins died before the Watkins empire was fully realized. It was his nephew Paul and his son-in-law E.L. King who took the company to its grandest heights after his death. He did not see the branches and the distribution centers pop up all over the world, and he did not see all the grand houses being built all over the country. He also did not see the branches close, nor the houses torn down, nor the business being sold to another family. J.R. Watkins started with a dream. He came to Minnesota in 1862 with his father and mother, Benjamin and Sophronia Watkins. Benjamin was a minister who left Cincinnati, Ohio, for a healthier climate and to preach the Bible. They settled with their 4 grown children in Plainview, Minnesota. Joseph Ray, the youngest, was 22 at the time. Joseph Ray saw firsthand how hard the people of the area worked. The farmers and the lumbermen around Plainview had lots of sore muscles because of the physical work they had to endure. It dawned on Joseph Ray that Dr. Ward's liniment could help the aches and pains of his hard-working neighbors. So he traveled back to Cincinnati to visit their old family friend and purchase the recipe for Dr. Ward's liniment and the rights to manufacture it. He also met and brought back the girl he would marry, Mary Ellen Eberling. She was a vivacious young woman from a well-to-do family. She dressed beautifully and was full of wit and kindness, according to Julia Watkins Frost, Joseph Ray's sister. In 1868, Joseph Ray, or J.R. as he was known in the business world, married and at the same time began manufacturing his own liniment on his own wood-burning stove in Plainview, Minnesota. After boiling it up in his kitchen, he took it out to the woodshed to bottle it. For 17 years, he experimented with different ways of selling his liniment. He tried drugstores and general stores and soon discovered that they bottled and presented their own liniment, leaving his to stand on the shelves. His next clever idea came at this point. He purchased a horse, a cart, and a picnic basket for $500 and went from door to door selling his liniment on his own.
Up until J.R. Watkins' time, people call them these medicine men, pots and pans salesmen and snake oil, and he legitimized direct selling with quality, and he was very cautious about anybody who became a dealer for him. They had to have the high morals, everything else, and his products were, the greatest.
In 1885, J.R. Watkins had 12 dealers working with him, covering a radius of 150 miles, when he got the idea, if these people need my liniment, everyone needs it, and he decided to leave Plainview and move to a more prosperous town. Winona in 1885 was the perfect city to begin the worldwide expansion of Watkins remedies. Winona was a town of 15,000 people at this time. The river brought in hundreds of boats per day to ship in ingredients and ship out products. The lumber industry and flour mills were thriving, and J.R. figured all the workers there would need his liniment. Plus, the Milwaukee, Chicago, and St. Paul railroads all ran through Winona, Minnesota, making business expansion a dream. In 1877, J.R. and Mary Ellen had a daughter, Grace. 2 years later, they had a son named George Benjamin, who died at the age of 14 months. J.R., Mary Ellen, and 8-year-old Grace moved into a house on 4th Street between Chestnut and Liberty. They used the downstairs as the factory for their liniment. 3 years later, J.R. decided to take several big steps. He began building his first factory building, which stood on the same spot as his rented house. He began to expand his line to include conditioning powder, stick salve, vegetable cathartic pills, and petrocarbo salve. He changed the name from Dr. Ward's to Watkins, and his business became known as the J.R. Watkins Medical Company. By 1892, his business was booming. His salesmen grew to 143, working in 15 states. At this point, he knew he needed help, and he sent for his nephew, Paul. 28-year-old Paul Watkins, his wife Florence, and 2-year-old son Roderick came from Columbus, Ohio, to help J.R. expand his business. Paul and J.R. began to branch off from the medical line in the 90s to include beauty aids and spices shortly thereafter. The biggest selling item was still the Watkins liniment. What was it about this liniment that made it so popular? They claimed it was good for man or beast, inside or out. It consisted of camphor, hot red peppers, oil of spruce and sassafras, mixed into 40% alcohol and 1/3 gram of opium. It could be used for anything, they said, from typhoid fever to raising better turkeys. With his first bottle of liniment, J.R. thought of another clever idea that spurred on the growth of his business. He had his bottles molded with a trial mark partway down the side. The customer was told to use the liniment to that mark, and if he wasn't satisfied by then, they would have their money refunded. The word about Watkins home remedies, their quality spices, extracts, and beauty products was spreading far and wide. Back in Winona, J.R. and his family were beginning to reap the benefits of his success. J.R. moved into a grand home at 206 East Broadway. The house was a beautiful Victorian with a wraparound porch, curved stained glass windows, turrets with finials, and a wrought iron railing at the peaks of the roof. This was just the beginning of the fancy homes the Watkins family would acquire throughout their 110 years of ownership of the Watkins Company. J.R. Watkins never stopped thinking about expansion. He purchased 15 acres of land during this time near Lake Winona to develop even another line of products.
Where the clinic is now.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that was the chicken farm. And He owned all the land from Franklin down to Mankato Avenue on the, what we would say, the other side of Sarnia Street. That's where his cows grazed. And then he had, quite a bit of land up along to the railroad tracks going east. And that's where he did his chicken. That's what they call it, the chicken farm. That's where he experimented with minerals. Mineral supplements for livestock and poultry. And that became the farm line end of the business. And that's where he did his experimenting originally.
In 1893, J.R. began to think nationally. Trains were accessible coast to coast, therefore Watkins products could be. He opened Watkins' first branch office in San Francisco, which later moved to Oakland, California. J.R. was constantly thinking of new ideas, and in 1901 he started his own printing business. He had his own labels printed for his products, and he began printing a yearly almanac, cookbooks, the home doctor book, and eventually calendars. By the turn of the century, things were happening fast for J.R. Watkins. To keep up with the success of his products, he had to expand the manufacturing plant. He added on to his original building and built 3 more 4-story buildings, all facing 4th Street. From 1907 to 1910, he would add 2 more buildings facing 3rd Street, one of which held the Watkins Press, the largest privately owned print shop west of Chicago, which produced almost 3 million copies of the Watkins Almanac, and later it printed the Watts News for the employees. Today it houses the museum. In 1904, 2 major events happen in J.R.'s life. His wife, Mary Ellen, dies, and a typewriter salesman that would eventually take over J.R.'s company enters the picture. Grace Watkins, J.R.'s 27-year-old daughter, falls head over heels in love with the handsome Ernest Lee King. They marry in 1904, and Ernest Lee, or E.L., began working for J.R. Watkins. 3 years later, in 1907, Mary Eleanor was born to Grace and E.L. King. She was obviously the light of their lives. Here we see her at age 2 in one of the last pictures taken with her grandfather, J.R. Watkins. Mary Eleanor grew up a very privileged child in an elegant era when little girls wore pretty white dresses to birthday parties and played tug-of-war on manicured lawns. 1907 to 1912 was a period of huge growth for the company. A branch was opened in Memphis, Tennessee, and another in Baltimore, Maryland, which later moved to Newark, New Jersey. During these years of growth, a large organization of Watkins employees began to develop. By 1911, there were 6,000 dealers. It became apparent to JR that the offices at 362 East 4th Street were no longer adequate to run the company from. Besides, he could see the direction the company was going. His little bottle of liniment was building an empire for him and needed a more fitting edifice to represent the company. He commissioned George Washington Mayer from Chicago to design the Watkins Administration Building. George Mayer was one of the premier architects in this country. He designed a prairie-style building in an elongated rectangular shape. Construction began on May 1st, 1911. For some reason, the city would not allow any scaffolding on the outside of the building, so it had to be erected from the inside out. Steel and concrete was used on the interior walls, and a smooth-cut blue Bedford stone was used on the outside. The roof is arched, originally all covered with copper on the outside. An imposing dome was built at the center, with an arched doorway at each end of the building and a larger one in the center. The building runs nearly the whole length of the block. It is 300 feet long and 70 feet wide. We will tour the interior of the administration building in the Watkins Today show. JR's magnificent office building was complete in 1912 for a cost of $175,000. It was recognized in the business world as the finest private administration building in the United States. JR would have been very proud the day of the grand opening, but an interesting turn of events happened before the building was complete. In September of 1911, at the age of 71, JR remarried, a woman 17 years younger than himself. And get this, she was the mother of his daughter's husband, E.L. King, making Grace and E.L. not only husband and wife, but stepsister and stepbrother. The four of them, JR, his new wife, Martha King, E.L., and Grace, all left for a honeymoon cruise from New York Harbor to Kingston, Jamaica. Grace wrote home from Jamaica on December 20th, stating that JR had stomach problems on the ship. The next day, JR died in Kingston, Jamaica. Joseph Ray never got to see the culmination of his dreams, the magnificent Mayer building constructed on a foundation of liniment, a symbol to a clever idea. After JR's death, Paul Watkins became the president and E.L. King moved up to the vice presidency. Under Paul's influence, the product line increased. New things were tried like spice blends and cake mixes. Liniment started taking second place to a more popular product at this time, Watkins Vanilla. A new branch office was opened in Winnipeg, Canada in 1913, and the big news in Winona that year was that Watkins would be building the tallest building in the city. The original factory building was razed, and a 10-story high building was constructed in its place. Above it, a 42-high-foot tower stood to house 4 mammoth lights. Their purpose was to light the surrounding area and draw attention to the magnificent Watkins block. The exterior was designed to harmonize with the administration building. It was designed again by George Mayer and built at a cost of $200,000. The company under Paul's leadership was experiencing phenomenal growth. The company was producing 150 products at this time, and by 1915 the J.R. Watkins Medical Company was firmly established as the largest direct sales company in the world. Because of Grace's strong influence in the company, it was apparent to Paul that E.L. King was there to stay, side by side with him in the management of the company.
People used to say, well, wasn't Paul Watkins the president of the company? Well, yeah, he was for a number of years. Well, then E.L. King, who ran the company?
Yeah.
Well, they had a good arrangement. Paul would run it for 6 months, and he'd go to Europe and that, and collect art and, you know, vacation. And then E.L. would be running the company. And then E.L. and Grace would take off for 6 months, go to Africa safaris, and or down to Florida and stuff like that. That didn't mean they weren't keeping track of what was going on back home or at the office, but yeah, they had a good arrangement.
The Kings during this time were experiencing the most rapid changes in their lives as well. The expansion of their company, the designing and building of 2 new homes, and the birth of their son. In 1914, Grace and E.L. had their second child, E.L. Jr., nicknamed Bud. Grace and E.L. liked George Mayer's work so well that they commissioned him to build their summer home in Winona and their winter home in Florida. Between the time of the design of the administration building and the 10-story factory building, George Mayer designed one of his most famous houses for Grace and E.L. King. Rockledge was built in front of a rocky facade of a bluff along the Mississippi River very near Winona. It was similar in design to many of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie-style houses, emphasizing horizontals and blending with the landscape. Rockledge was a 10,000-square-foot house, and everything inside of it was designed by George Mayer. The furniture was built in a trapezoidal design with an arch at the top. We see this design in the arched entrance on the outside as well. This theme was created throughout the house. Unfortunately, these are the only pictures available to show examples of his design. Another theme he used throughout the home was that of the daylily, which grew prolifically on the outside of the house. We see the lily in the silver tea services he designed. Also embossed in the silver set are the King's initials. In the 1930s, Grace and E.L. took out all of George Mayer's famous designs and replaced the whole interior with the Art Deco look. Rockledge was used by the Kings only in the summer. The rest of the year they lived in Daytona Beach, where they had George Mayer build them another home, across from their private 18-hole golf course, Seabreeze. This home was built in 1914 for a cost of $50,000. The golf course was located on one side of the house, and their yacht was located on the other side. I think that is just about as good as it gets. It was sold in the 20s for $150,000. E.L. was considered a genius in his ability to make the right purchases at the right time, as well as to sell his holdings before a drop in real estate prices. George Mayer and E.L. King were becoming pretty good friends by this time, and in 1916, he and Grace commissioned Mayer to design and build the Winona National Bank, or the Watkins Bank as it was called. Tell me about E.L. What type of a person was E.L.?
I suppose I have to be careful about what I'm saying now, but he was a fantastic businessman, but a rougher than a cop. Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, when you look at the history of all these guys, like Rockefeller, and, well, anyway, they weren't really the nicest people in business. They were tough, and he was tough, and he watched every segment of that business daily. And just like when they'd be in Florida, for instance, in the winter, as the story goes, he'd call sometimes 10, 12 times a day, checking on this, checking on that. He didn't just relax in Florida. He was keeping an eye on everything. One of the things he loved best to do was to go out to the different branches unannounced.
See what they were doing.
See what the heck they were doing. Yeah. Nobody knew he was coming. And there's a million stories about what took place on some of these surprise visits.
No doubt by the 1920s, E.L. King was becoming the driving force behind the Watkins Company. But the image of the Watkins man is what was selling the Watkins products. He was friendly, he had a good variety of products for everyday use, and he brought the products right to the door. Up until the 20s, he traveled with his buggy or automobile in the rural areas, but in 1919, the city sales department was founded, and the Watkins man began carrying his case from door to door in just about every town in the nation. The 1920s represented the pinnacle of success for the J.R. Watkins Company and saw a real creative boom. With the expansion of new products, the word medical was dropped from the company's title, and from this time on was known as the Watkins Company. In next week's show, we will learn about the Watkins Company from 1920 to 1977. I'm Joyce Woodworth. Join me next week for a continuation of the Watkins story. Till then, enjoy the Spirit of Winona. Hello, I'm Joyce Woodworth. Welcome to the Spirit of Winona and the second part of the J.R. Watkins Company and Family History Show. In Part 1, we learned the history of the Watkins Company from its onset in 1868 up to the Roaring '20s. J.R. Watkins ran the company until his death in 1911, at which time his nephew Paul took over as president and his son-in-law E.L. King became the vice president. E.L. King was married to Grace Watkins, J.R.'s only daughter. The history of Paul Watkins can be seen in the two-part Watkins Manor show. The clashing sizes and styles of buildings we see today that occupy the Watkins block between 3rd and 4th and Liberty and Chestnut Streets were all built in a period of 25 years. J.R. Watkins' first building, constructed in 1888, was torn down in 1913 to make way for what is still the tallest structure in Winona, the 10-story manufacturing building, which was the last building built on this block. These buildings mirror the robust growth that took place in the company up to 1920. The biggest growth was yet to come, however, not on the Watkins block in Winona necessarily, but throughout the nation and eventually beyond. The 20s became the pinnacle of success for the Watkins Company, primarily because of the introduction of city sales. The first of the city branches or distribution centers was opened in Chicago, Illinois in 1920, and shortly thereafter one was opened in Cleveland, then Buffalo, Detroit, New York, St. Louis, Kansas City, Atlanta, and Houston. By the end of the 1920s, the Watkins Company extended its reach to every part of the country. Up to this time, dealers were used to selling to the farmers, where they were welcomed with open arms, bringing news of the city with them and bringing products that were difficult to get in the country. Selling door to door in the city was another matter. The psychology of selling to the housewife in town had to be worked out. Whether it was the different approach or the products themselves, city sales became even more successful than the rural sales. A new line of products were introduced at this time, which were a huge factor in the success of the company. Paul Watkins, J.R.'s nephew, was the president of the company from 1911 until 1931. He ran the company for 6 months of the year and traveled throughout Europe the other 6 months. During his European visits, he became quite infatuated with Lake Garda in Italy. Revering the finer things in life, he decided to expand the meager beauty aids Watkins had to offer into a new cosmetic line. He called Garda after the lovely lake in Italy. Garda remained the cosmetic line until 1928, when Watkins wanted to do something to signify their 60th anniversary, and E.L. and Grace King wanted to include their 21-year-old daughter, Mary Eleanor, in the business. Lovely Mary Eleanor, or Marielle as she preferred to be called, had the perfect looks to advertise the new line of what was now called Mary King Cosmetics. She became quite involved and helped expand the line. The Mary King cosmetic line became extremely popular with all of Watkins' customers and very important to the company.
Back in those days, Avon, as it's been known now for years, was a California perfume company. Okay. They didn't go door to door or anything, but they watched what Watkins was doing, and when Watkins got into cosmetics too, you know, hell, if the Watkins man can sell cosmetics, and Marielle was a spokesperson for Mary King Cosmetics, obviously. So the California Perfume Company decided, well, hey, maybe we got to try it. We'll have women. That's how Avon got started.
Oh, is that right?
In fact, they used to rent space at a lot of the Watkins branches, so the district managers would help hold the Avon meetings. Because in those days, woman going door to door? Those Avon people were nuts. Sure they were.
It seemed like practically every idea Watkins had and every new product introduced turned to gold. In fact, in 1928, Watkins did receive a gold medal in the 1928 Paris International Exposition on Wellness for its outstanding vanilla extract, cinnamon, and black pepper. They did, however, start one line of products in the 20s that backfired, so to speak, their automobile accessories. Their feature product in the line was their Big W tires, which had a string of W's, which stood for Watkins, embossed in the rubber and served as the tread. Perhaps this was a little too egotistical for the times. E.L. King, the vice president of the company in the 20s, was an avid hunter. He loved guns and he loved to shoot, as did his wife, Grace. Grace Watkins was one of the best women markswomen in the world. Her father, J.R., introduced her through a mutual friend to Annie Oakley in the 1890s. Miss Oakley taught Grace Watkins how to shoot a gun and how to shoot it well. In 1922 and 1923, Grace was named the Women's World Trap Shooting Champion. She and her husband provided the clubhouse for the Winona Sportsman Club, which had a trap shooting range where Westfield Golf Course now stands. Trap shooting in the 20s was even more popular than golf is today. They eventually gave the land surrounding the trap shooting range to the city for a golf course. Grace and E.L. took 2 major safari trips to Africa in the 1920s. In 1924, they took their 10-year-old son, E.L. Jr., or Buddy as he was called then, with them. This trip was extensive, lasting for months. On this safari, the King shot many animals, some of which are stuffed and on display at the Winona National Bank. They shot at random. Buddy killed a hippopotamus, as did Grace. They also shot and killed zebras. Mrs. King killed a 5-ton elephant on this trip, the largest ever shot in East Africa by a woman up to 1924. She rationalized the killing in the book she wrote, Hunting Big Game in Africa, by stating the African elephant is much different from the Indian elephant of the circus. It is extremely dangerous and overturns villages, killing natives. Here we see Grace, E.L., and their guide sitting on the tusk of the great elephant. Grace brought back the tusks as a souvenir. Africa hunting trips for the purpose of hunting and killing large game animals was an accepted and admired thing to do in this era, particularly in the company of high society. In 1926, they took another extensive safari trip to Africa, this time in the Tanganyika territory of East Africa, where they hunted primarily lions. They shot and killed 18, which they had mounted and returned to the United States. They also brought back 3 lion cubs and housed them in the stone barn at Rockledge and raised them to maturity.
They brought, from the one safari, they brought several lions back, and of course then this building was built almost, well, it was a servant's building to start with, but then the additions that were put on and the cages were for the lions. And everything was going fine down there till one day, one of the yard men who had helped around the lions was going to be a little clever and show off for his relatives who were stopped by to say hi, and threw some meat in one of the pens and then reached in, he was going to take it away from the lion. Well, he got mauled. Oh. And that's when Mr. and Mrs. King Sr., they had 12 lions at that time, and they gave them to the Brookfield Zoo.
In the summer of 1927, the Kings held the social event of the year on the grounds of Rockledge, the wedding of their daughter Marielle to Ralph Bolt, who became a vice president in the Watkins Company. The grounds around Rockledge were groomed to perfection. Extra chauffeurs parked the Rolls Royces and Pierce Arrows, while a score of maids and butlers served the distinguished guests, and detectives were hired to patrol the grounds and watch over the gifts. People who arrived early cooled off in the new $75,000 pool, which had just been installed the year before and included a screened-in porch and a stone patio at one end. A path of flowers led to a latticed archway, which was set up directly next to Rockledge, under which the ceremony took place. The father of the bride decided it was an occasion to toss the gun away that he always carried with him and enjoy the day with the rest of the wedding party, and enjoy they did. We see Mr. and Mrs. Bolt on the far left with E.L. and Grace next to them. Grace is fanning herself. Next are the 6 bridesmaids, groomsmen, and ushers. Everyone is having a blast. The bride and groom appeared so incredibly happy, you would have thought the marriage could last forever. And then tell me about Kingswear. What was that built for?
Marielle and Ralph.
Okay.
When they got married, that was one of the presents from Mr. King and Mrs. King Sr. In fact, I've got the book upstairs, everybody, all the presents that, and the last entry is from Mother and Dad here, a large house.
And it was a beauty.
Yeah, geez.
Nice wedding present.
Yeah.
The home was built on the same grounds as Rockledge, just west of the swimming pool. E.L. King commissioned George Mayer's son, Philip, to design the beautiful French chateau-style home called Kingswear for Marielle and Ralph. The house still exists and has been kept as original as possible by its new owners. By the late 1920s and early 30s, the Watkins Company was going gangbusters. In 1929, when the nation's depression began, the company remained profitable. Their products were household necessities, not luxuries, and let's not forget the liniment. Despite Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, it still had alcohol in it and could be taken internally. The Watkins family members were not hiding the fact that they were making money during this time. As Kingswear was being constructed, so was the Watkins Manor being built by Paul Watkins. And back in Daytona Beach, E.L. and Grace King were constructing another home. The family called it the Pink Palazzo. It was designed by the famous architect of Miami, Addison Meisner. This home was of a completely different style from Mayer's design. It was in the Mediterranean style, which Meisner built all of Boca Raton in. There we still see the pink Spanish Revival architecture that became his well-known signature. The pink-arched King home was built for a cost of $150,000, which was an enormous sum then when you consider the craftsmen received $6 a day and the laborers received $2 a day. Frank, now I know that Grace and E.L. had a lot of houses around the country, in different parts of the country, one in Hawaii maybe and one in Tahoe. Tell me where they had all the houses and what was the purpose of having all those houses?
I think that's a great question. Yes, they did have a lot of houses, a lot of large houses. Well, okay. Daytona Beach, Florida, big one. That was a big one. Then they had a hunting lodge in Mississippi. At one point, they owned a very large estate in Atlanta, which the Georgia government bought from them and made it the governor's mansion. Of course, here in Winona, you had Rockledge, Kingsware, and then up on the hill, Kings Bluff Estate. Out in Riverside, California, was another estate. Lake Tahoe is the one that people, I think, in this area have heard more talk about than anything else. And of course, and then there was the hunting lodge up in Canada.
And do they have one in Hawaii too?
A lovely house, Mrs. King Sr., yes. In fact, she built a new house 2 houses over from where Marielle built a new house, out on Portlock Road on the island of Oahu. Yeah, they had a lot of properties all over the place.
What was the purpose of having so many houses?
I don't know. I really did. I've often wondered that myself.
Along with the houses, land was accumulated as well. Directly above Kingsware on the ridge, approximately 1,400 acres were purchased and turned into the Watkins Experimental Farm.
This is one of the first corporate experimental farms as such in the country. As a matter of fact, and with our entomologists, we were the second company in the country, not a university, to have an entomologist, Dr. Donor. But the experimental farm, it was like a farm. It wasn't everything, prim and proper and that. And for some years they brought 250,000 people just to visit, to go through Watkins and go up on the experimental farm. And it covered everything basic to farming. Let's take the hogs, for instance. There's 5 pens, each with 50 little baby pigs in it. The first one would get like the old style feeding, like farmers did for years, slop the hogs and that. And the next one would maybe get certain minerals added to that. Then the next one would get certain vitamins along with the minerals. And by the time you had this 5th group, they would get all the basics plus growth factors or things like that that would be thrown into it. And it was so fascinating. You could get a 200-pound hog with 1/4 inch of back fat to market in 5 months. Where over here, it would take over a year from pen number 1 to get them even close to it, and then they'd be fat.
In December of 1931, Paul Watkins died and E.L. King became president. He was a tenacious leader.
Just started in, hey, we're going to expand, and they did. He was one hell of a businessman.
So
no screwing around either.
So then Watkins was quite successful under his ruling. Like in
Very,
the 30s
yeah,
and the 40s,
yeah.
it was very successful.
A composite was made up in the 1930s of the Watkins City, showing all the major buildings belonging to the company throughout the nation. Under E.L. King's tenure as president, the company grew to 137 factories and branches, over 300 products, and 10,000 dealers. Marielle and Ralph had been married for 7 years when they decided to adopt their dream child. Sweet little Patricia enters the Watkins family in 1934. Even her sweetness could not keep her parents' marriage together, and soon after she arrived, Ralph and Marielle divorced. Patricia was the golden child. She was so irresistible as a 4-year-old that they put her on the Watkins calendar in 1939. She grew up to be a beautiful young woman, and in 1951 married her high school sweetheart, handsome Frank Murtis.
Started dating Pat back in high school days and that. And of course, and also in those days, I worked at the McConnell Company in the summers. Because I didn't think just because I was starting to date somebody with Watkins that I had to work at Watkins. And we were married in 1951. Of course, then I went to work for Watkins. Started off in the factory and eventually went through every department and then out in the office. And of course, then into sales. They put a rural carrying case in my hand, weighed 62 pounds, sent me out with a rural dealer, Tom Jensen, right over here in Wisconsin. And my first sales of Watkins product took place in Fountain City. and with a 62-pound case, and going up to every front door. Holy mackerel! I tell you, that was an experience.
What kinds of things did you sell in that case?
If you were selling in town, you didn't have any of the farm line items, of course, because then it was the spices, extract, household, the cleaning items, the pineapple disinfectants, and all this kind of stuff. It was mainly things that the wife really wanted. When you got out in the country, of course, then it was different. Then it was everything from fly spray to dips and minerals and vitamins.
To support his expansion ideas in the 30s, E.L. King brought in his brothers Curtis and Leroy to run the Memphis plant, and his brother-in-law, D.C. Alexander, to become his vice president in Winona. He and his wife, Maud, lived in this beautiful yellow Tudor-style home on Broadway. In the mid-30s, Watkins expanded internationally when Ralph Bolt, also a vice president, opened a branch in Melbourne, Australia. Eventually, a plant was opened in New Zealand, England, Sweden, Puerto Rico, and Africa. Africa became the largest maker of cosmetics. There were 2 plants in Africa, one in Cape Town and one in Johannesburg. Here they also produced lipsticks for Max Factor and other cosmetic companies of the day. Meanwhile, in Winona, Muriel was expanding the Mary King line as well. She had a passion for seashells and had the packaging of her products changed to seashell pink.
Tell me about Mary Eleanor. What was she like?
Oh, gosh, she's a dynamo. I mean, a real dynamo. She did so many good things that nobody never heard about. In Winona, she was known as fast and loose and wild and everything else. And she was. Yeah. But just fabulous. There's never any grass growing under her tires. During the war, hell, she was one of the biggest promoters of bundles for Britain in the state of Florida. She started, you're going to find this hard to believe because very few people have ever heard this or know about it. She started the Daytona races. They weren't called the Daytona in those days. It was the Teddy Racing Cup. And Teddy Racing was a race driver in England. He was killed in an RAF night flight, but they were engaged at the time. And he was a well-known racing guy.
After his death, Muriel married his best friend, also an Englishman and a playboy, Goldie Gardner.
And in conchology, she became really, at one point, probably the world's greatest conchologist. The conchology department of the Bishop Museum in Hawaii, she practically built it. She sponsored and all these trips she bought.
In the 1940s, Muriel married Tony Thonen, her third husband. They built a fabulous house on top of the bluff above Kingsweir. It is reported that she never liked Kingsweir, and years earlier she left it for her brother Bud to live in. The French provincial-style house was a 37-room mansion that overlooked the Mississippi River. 4 years after their marriage, Mr. Thonen committed suicide here while Muriel was filing for divorce in Nevada. Muriel married one more time to Lauren Lowe, her sister-in-law's brother. She spent the last 18 years of her life in Hawaii, where she died at the age of 62. In 1935, E.L. King Jr., or Bud, became a vice president in Watkins, and 9 years later he took over as president when E.L. Sr. stepped down because of failing health. He implemented innovative ideas during this time, such as profit sharing for the employees. He expanded the farm line. He encouraged his dealers to visit the plant in Winona. He began company picnics for his employees. He expanded the human nutrition line, and during World War II, he turned over 90% of Watkins' production to the war effort. Bud was married 3 times. His first wife, Neil McGinnis, died after 10 years of marriage, leaving 3 small boys to care for. A year later, he remarried and had a daughter. In his later years, he married a very charitable woman from Winona, Betty Callender, who outlived Bud by 5 years and ended up giving the money he left her to charitable causes in Winona. In 1949, Ernest Leon, or E.L. King, Sr., died at the age of 72, and Bud became in charge of the company. According to his daughter, Bud did not have a passion for the business like his father or grandfather did. He was creative, shy, and reclusive, and not businesslike.
And how did Bud King do with the company?
He was very fortunate to have 4 men that could run the company beautifully, and therefore he didn't have to worry about running the company.
In the 50s, times were changing. Women were beginning to leave the homes for employment, and Watkins dealers were knocking on the doors of empty houses. Bud began a quality control effort that made products cost more, and dealers made less profits. In 1960, an expensive television campaign was begun to boost product sales.
Here's the product that Watkins is famous for. It's Watkins Vanilla. Fine cooks now for 4 or 5 generations have been depending on this vanilla to make the old favorite family recipes taste just right. And modern cooks, well, they even like to add it to their cake mixes to spark up that flavor. It's really quite a product, Watkins Vanilla. Actually, vanilla is just one of over 250 different products that you can buy from your Watkins dealer. Some of them he'll have in his case here. And of course, he can't carry all of them with him, so you'll probably want to look through his illustrated products catalog to see what else that you'd like to buy. And there are loads of fine things here. Your Watkins dealer will be calling on you soon. When he rings your doorbell, welcome him.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm your Watkins dealer. I stopped by to pick up the catalog and to bring that free gift I promised you. May I come in and give it to you?
Sure, come in.
There's only one place on earth where you can get vanilla like that. That's from your Watkins dealer, sitting right there. So you better buy it right now.
This expensive television campaign only lost money for Watkins. By this time, the Watkins man was an anachronism. Bud's mother Grace and his sister Mariel were living in Hawaii at this time, but reading the profit statements of the company they controlled 80% of. Neither were happy with the slim profits the company was making, so they worked out a plan with Ralph Bolt, one of the vice presidents, to sell the company to Pfizer Pharmaceutical Company. However, Bud still owned 10% and wasn't selling, and the deal fell through. Mariel and Grace then convinced the board of directors to hire the Kearney Management Consulting Firm to put the Watkins Company back on track. Thus, the first non-Watkins related person became president of Watkins, James Doyle.
Doyle came in, 63? January 1st, 63. In 2 years after he was there, it's the first year the company ever lost money.
So evidently then Doyle did not stay with the company.
Oh, yes. He was with the company for almost 10 years.
Okay. So did it ever
I
improve itself?
I
Okay,
left
you
at
left
65.
then.
I thought, hell, I can't I'm gonna stick around with this guy.
His plan was to expand the line to include over 350 products, mostly cosmetics, and follow in Avon's footsteps. To facilitate the expansion, the outlying real estate was sold and the company's losses began almost immediately. About $1 million per year in the 10 years he was president. An interesting fact here, in those 10 years of pushing cosmetics, the original liniment, minus the opium and alcohol and used only for external purposes, still remained one of the top bestsellers. In 1972, the company lost $2.6 million. In 1973, Bud King fired James Doyle and appointed his son David the third King president. Grace died in 1975 at the age of 98. Bud became the majority stockholder. The rapid spiral that brought the company to bankruptcy began here. Attempts were made to try new marketing methods, but it was too late to turn the company around. A last-ditch effort was tried in 1977 when a new president was appointed, Jerome Rose, to take the company into retail sales. Instead, the company went into Chapter 11. Another person entered as an interim president named Irwin Balto to help the family regain ownership. Unfortunately, he had a heart attack and time ran out for the King family. In 1978, the company was sold to the highest bidder. Irwin Jacobs. Watkins became his for $4.6 million. The splendor of the King family died 9 years later, symbolically with the destruction of Rockledge, George Mayer's masterpiece built for the Kings. Its gradual decline began when they changed the prairie-style look it was meant to have to the Art Deco look, then letting it go year by year until the damage was irreparable. Bud King had it torn down in 1987 because he did not have the energy nor the desire to repair it. That same year, E.L. King Jr. or Bud passed away, and with him an era of splendor for one family, the likes of we may never see again. J.R. Watkins would have been pleased to see that his clever ideas built an empire for his family and his company that touched all parts of the world. For 100 years, the Watkins family ran the company at a profit. A 1922 financial statement showed a net profit of $2.3 million on sales of $6 million. The 10 years the company slid into bankruptcy, I'm sure, like the remaining members of the Watkins family, J.R., the father of it all, would have preferred not to see.
What J.R. Watkins would have seen today, however, is that the original lineament that he built the foundation of his business on has endured and has remained like the glue from generation to generation and family to family as the foundation that keeps this company together. In 1977, the Watkins Company went bankrupt. In next week's show, we will meet one of the family members who now owns Watkins, and we will see what the company is like today. I'm Joyce Woodworth. Join me next week for a continuation of the Watkins story. Till then, enjoy the Spirit of Winona.